Los Angeles drank a whole lake. In 1913, the city opened an aqueduct, pulled the Owens River south, and by 1926, a body of water that had covered 110 square miles was gone. What it left behind is now the single biggest source of dust pollution in the United States. On a windy afternoon, that dry lake bed can throw 50 tons of powder into the air every second. The powder carries arsenic, cadmium, and nickel. 40,000 people live downwind. Los Angeles has spent $2.5 billion trying to hold it down. Then, one storm season undid a piece of it in a week. This is Owens Lake, about 220 miles north of downtown Los Angeles, wedged in a long valley between the Sierra Nevada and the Inyo Mountains. On the worst days, the dust that lifts off it hits 130 times the federal limit for particle pollution, and it can climb almost 2 miles into the sky and travel more than 200 miles before it settles. It has closed highways. It has buried towns in a fine gray film. It has sent people indoors with their eyes and throats burning for the better part of a century. But here is the detail that tells the real story. The strange part is not that Los Angeles emptied the lake. The strange part is what came after. 100 years later, the emptiest place in California is also one of the most expensive, and the machine built to keep its dust on the ground is now fighting the city that built it for the exact thing they both need: water. Owens Valley, California, the early 1900s. Before the aqueduct, this was farm country and mining country, and the Owens River was the reason both were there. Snowmelt came down off the Sierra Nevada every spring, ran the length of the valley, and pooled at the bottom into a real lake, deep, blue, and alive. It covered around 110 square miles. In its known history, it ran about 30 feet deep. Steamboats crossed it, hauling silver bars from the Cerro Gordo mines across to the wagons that carried it south. Birds worked the shallows by the tens of thousands. So many that a nature expert who visited in 1917 wrote that there must be literally thousands of birds within sight of one spot. Then, Los Angeles came looking for water. In the first years of the century, agents working quietly for the city moved through the valley, buying up land and the water rights attached to it. Some of them pretended to be farmers and ranchers to keep the sellers from seeing what was really happening. By the time the valley figured it out, Los Angeles owned the river, and there was no legal way to get it back. In 1913, the Los Angeles Aqueduct opened. The chief engineer, William Mulholland, stood in front of the crowd as the first water came rushing down the concrete and said 5 words. There it is. Take it. And the city took it. The lake did not vanish overnight. That is the part people miss. The river that refilled it every spring was gone, sent 200 miles south, but the sun kept pulling water off the surface the way it always had. So, every summer, the lake dropped a little lower. The shoreline crept a little further out. The pale ring of dried salt and mineral around the edges grew a little wider each year, like a bathtub slowly draining with the tap shut off. By 1926, the water was just about gone. What had been a lake was now a flat white plain of dried chemicals and fine dirt, about 110 square miles of it, wide open to the wind. And the wind found it. The first great dust storms rolled off the dry lake within a few years, and they were nothing like normal dust. This was fine, harsh powder, ground down over thousands of years at the bottom of a lake, packed with salts and mixed with arsenic, cadmium, and other metals. When it lifted, it did not drift slowly. It rolled across the valley in gray and yellow walls that swallowed whole towns and blotted out the mountains. Government estimates would later put the worst years at up to 300,000 tons of particle pollution off the lakebed each year, including roughly 30 tons of arsenic and 9 tons of cadmium every year. For decades, nobody with real power did much about it. The people who lived downwind coughed, taped their windows, and waited for the wind to change. That changed in 1987, when the federal government officially named the Owens Valley an area that failed the clean air rules for PM10. That is the science name for particle pollution small enough to slip past the body's defenses and get stuck deep in the lungs. The label meant the air here broke the nation's health law. It also meant that, finally, somebody was on the hook to fix it. It took another 13 years of lawsuits and standoffs to decide who and how. But in 2000, Los Angeles began building the biggest dust control project in the history of the United States, directly on top of the lake it had drained. Now, zoom out, because the shape of the land here is the whole story. Owens Valley is a deep trench cut between two mountain walls. To the west stands the Sierra Nevada, a granite ridge that includes Mount Whitney, the tallest peak in the lower 48 states at over 14,000 feet. To the east rise the Inyo and White Mountains, nearly as high. The valley floor runs narrow and long between them, and the lake bed sits at the very low point, where everything drains and nothing leaves. That shape is a trap. When wind pours down off the high country and crosses the open lake bed, it scoops up the loose surface and funnels it straight down the gap toward the towns. On the eastern shore sits Keeler, a town of fewer than 100 people, close enough that on a bad day people cannot see across the street. Further along the valley lie Lone Pine, Olancha, and Cartago. Count everyone breathing this air, from Bishop in the north down to Ridgecrest in the south, and you get to roughly 40,000 people. They are not downwind of a smokestack or a freeway. They are downwind of an empty space, a lake that was taken. Here is how that empty lake bed makes its dust, because the way it works is stranger than it looks. The powder that does the real damage, the PM10, is far too fine for normal wind to pick up on its own. Left alone, it stays locked in the crust of the lake bed. What breaks it loose is bigger and heavier. When the wind climbs past about 20 miles an hour, it starts rolling bigger grains of sand across the surface. Those grains bounce, low and fast, and every time one lands, it shatters the crumbly salt crust and blasts a small cloud of fine powder up into the air. The wind lifts that powder and keeps the sand bouncing, and each hit frees more and more and more. Think of it as a belt sander dragged across a slab of chalk. The bouncing sand is the belt. The choking cloud that comes off it is the poison. That is why a mild wind at Owens Lake, the kind of breeze a city on the coast would never even notice, can put more particle pollution into the air than any other single source in America. A hurricane would be too much. All the lake needs is a steady wind and a dry surface, and it gets both 25 or more times a year, mostly in spring and fall. Theodore Schad spent years as the air pollution control officer for the Great Basin Unified Air Pollution Control District, the small agency with the huge job of making Los Angeles clean up its mess. He named the reason on the record and did not soften it. The dust controls here are the most expensive in the country, he said, for one reason. The air pollution was caused by the water the city took away, and taking that water created the biggest single source of particle pollution in the nation. We are just doing our job, he added. The fix Los Angeles built is really huge, and it works. That is the part almost nobody outside the valley understands. Across 48.6 square miles of the old lake bed, an area about the size of the whole city of San Francisco, the city laid down a control system built around three main tools. The biggest by far is shallow flooding, a huge grid of computer-controlled valves, buried pipes, and sprinklers spreads a thin sheet of water across the lake bed on a set schedule, keeping most of the surface wet, so the sand cannot bounce and the crust cannot break. To meet the rules, roughly 3/4 of a flooded area has to stay wet or soaked through the whole dust season. The second tool is managed plants, fields of native saltgrass planted to break the wind down at ground level. The third is a plain blanket of gravel, holding the surface down by weight alone. Together, these steps have cut the dust coming off the lake by 99.4%. In the year 2000, the lake was estimated to throw off more than 62,000 tons of PM10 a year. By 2023, that number was down to 355 tons. In plain terms, Los Angeles took the worst single air pollution source in the United States and silenced almost all of it. The trouble is, what silence costs. The bill lands in steps, and it spreads outward from the lake bed like the dust once did. First, the lake bed itself. Holding down 48.6 square miles of poison dust is not a job you finish. The valves turn on and off every single day on their set schedules. The saltgrass has to be watered, fed, and replanted. The gravel has to be kept up. The whole machine has to run forever, because the moment the water stops, the dust comes straight back. There is no finish line here, only upkeep that runs as long as Los Angeles keeps paying for it. Second, the towns and the lungs. Even at 99.4% control, the last bit still bites. On the biggest wind days, the edges with no controls and the dune fields around the lake still lift, and the people of Keeler and Lone Pine still go inside and shut the doors. For generations, doctors and scientists have tied this dust to asthma, bronchitis, sinus infections, weaker lungs, and worse. A retired man in Keeler once put the daily truth of it in the simplest words. "When it is blowing real bad," he said, "you have to go inside. The dust collects on your hair, your clothes, everything." Third, the tribes. The Owens Valley is the ancient home of the Paiute people, and the lake bed holds sites important to them that are hundreds of years older than the aqueduct. The problem is that the heavy machines and land flattening that some dust control needs can tear straight through that ground. In recent years, the city and the air district have ended up in an open fight over how to hold the dust down without ruining places the tribes hold sacred. The cleanup itself became a second kind of damage, stacked on top of the first. If you are finding this useful, subscribe. We cover the places where water, land, and people clash every week, with the full picture you need to actually follow what is going on. By 2023, the fourth cost came due, and it fell out of the sky. For most of 20 years, the control system held the line. Then, the winter and spring of 2023 slammed California with one giant storm after another. In March, floodwater broke through the Los Angeles aqueduct itself. Water surged into the lakebed in amounts the control system was never built to take. The salty pool at the center of the lakebed, which normally holds about 5,000 acre-feet of water, swelled to around 50,000 acre-feet. That flooding swamped and damaged dust control gear across the lake. Then, in August, Tropical Storm Hillary drove up from the south and pushed still more water across the lakebed, flooding control systems that were already struggling. For a time, the machine built to keep the lake dry and flat was underwater. A dust control system knocked out by too much water. So the lake that Los Angeles emptied spent 2023 fighting the city with the only weapon it had left, which was weather. Fifth, and this is the cost that reaches far past the valley, is the water itself. Keeping Owens Lake damp is expensive in dollars, and even more expensive in the one thing the whole American West is running short of. Every year, Los Angeles spreads roughly 60,000 acre-feet of water across the dry lake bed just to hold the dust down. That is not a trickle poured on a problem. That is enough water to serve 240,000 homes for a full year. Anselmo Collins, a senior assistant general manager for the water system at the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, spelled out how big it is on the record. The city leaves 60,000 acre-feet of water at Owens each year for dust, he said, which is roughly the same amount the whole city of Long Beach, with almost 500,000 people, uses in a year. And in one recent year, he noted, Los Angeles spent more water holding down the dust at Owens than it brought in through the aqueduct for its own customers. The dead lake now drinks more water than the living city it was drained to serve. That is why, even after reaching more than 99% control, Los Angeles has been fighting to be done. In recent years, the city said it had cut the dust by 99.4% at a total cost above $2.5 billion, and it asked the officials to officially say the lake now met the clean air rules. In the clear at last. The president of the city's own water board called the spending jaw-dropping and pointed out that a big share of the people paying the bill are struggling to get by. The city has also accused the air district of going too far and gone to court over fines it calls illegal. The valley, for its part, has spent 100 years watching Los Angeles look for the exit and does not plan to hand it one cheaply. There is a case like this already, and it sits about 100 miles north. Mono Lake was the city's other Eastern Sierra prize, another desert lake that Los Angeles took water from and drained down through the 20th century. As Mono dropped, its own bare shoreline began throwing dust of its own, and the life around it began to collapse. It took a famous court fight, decided in the 1990s, to force the city to let that lake rise back up. And on the far side of the world sits the worst version of this same story, the Aral Sea in Central Asia. Once one of the biggest lakes on Earth, drained when its water was pulled away for farming, into a dust bowl that poisoned the air for millions. Owens, Mono, and the Aral all teach the same lesson from three directions. Pull the water out of a desert lake and you get stuck with what it leaves behind, a wound that keeps charging you in dollars, in health, and in the very water you took it for. And now there is a warning sign that the whole fight is about to move. For years, the thinking was simple. The dust comes off the lake bed, so you control the lake bed. But a recent study by a group of scientists at the National Academies found that most of the valley's remaining bad air days no longer come from the lake at all. They come from sources off the lake, dune fields like the Keeler Dunes on the northeast corner, and dried-out ground north of the lake, where the underground water has dropped and the plants holding the soil in place have dried up. The scientists pointed to exactly where the next problem could open. If drought and more pumping of underground water keep lowering the water underground across the valley, more of that northern ground could dry out and start to blow. The lake bed is mostly held now. The land around it may be the next thing to lift. Every acre of plants lost as the underground water drops looks like a small thing at the time. Stack up enough of them, and you have built the next dust source in a valley that already breathes the worst air in the country. The city fixed the lake and may be quietly making a new one a few miles to the north. So the questions stack up over the valley tonight. How long can a single city keep 48.6 square miles of desert wet on purpose, forever, in a place that is running out of water? What happens to the whole control system the next time a winter like 2023 arrives, when the science says those storms get stronger, not weaker? If the lake is finally under control but the land around it is starting to blow, has anything actually been solved, or has the problem simply walked a few miles north and changed its name? And who pays for the next 100 years of it, in a city where a big share of the people paying can barely afford the water they already buy? Nobody has those answers yet. What is sure is what happens at first light. Every morning, out on the flat white bed of the lake that Los Angeles drank dry, the valves open. Water pushes through miles of buried pipe and spreads out in a thin, careful sheet across the lake bed, soaking the surface, pinning the powder down for one more day. 40,000 people downwind wake up and check the wind before they open a door. And the wind is already moving, down off the mountains, out across the open ground, looking for anything dry enough to lift.